So welcome back. My name is Stacy Gagnon. I am the director and founder of Trauma Lens Care. And my husband Darren and I, we have been asked to do a series of videos. And so this is video 3. And we will be talking about windows of tolerance, which is a concept that was first coined or explained by Dan Siegel. And so we're going to go a little bit more in depth with it, and we're going to talk about how this played out in our home.
Yeah, so when in our last video we talked about 2 foster children that we got, Jack and Jill, and when we look back at what we saw with them, it really resonated with Stacey and I when we started learning about windows of tolerance, about thinking back to the things we saw with them and with other foster children, about how it made so much sense. And so we're gonna show you a little graphic on what the window of tolerance sort of looks like, but its ability for a person, not just a child, but for a person to be able to regulate themselves in light of stressful events. So that's where we're going to go.
So what we know about kids experiencing trauma is that they're going to implement or utilize survival strategies. And so I've seen this play out not only in my home with foster children and my adopted children, but I've also seen this play out in the classroom and in the community. And so what kids tend to do is one of 2 things. They either go hypervigilant or they go hypovigilant. Hypervigilance is distractible, aggressive, hyperactive, an inability to concentrate. A lot of times they are very controlling, seemingly manipulative. These are all things that a lot of times can be misdiagnosed as ADD or ADHD. And so there is a really big overlap between trauma and ADD, ADHD. And so that is one of the things that we recommend a lot when we're working with families, is when you receive a new foster child in your home, that you should not be looking for a label or diagnosis early on, because these are survival strategies in children. The other thing that we see is hypovigilance. Hypovigilance is flat affect, blunted, listless, distractible, the 1,000-yard stare. And when I say that, and you have worked with children, I guarantee you know exactly what I mean when I say the 1,000-yard stare. So if we take Jack and Jill, they are actually the picture-perfect example of these survival strategies in children. Jack was very, very hypervigilant. His strategy for the trauma was to go into this mode of being hyperactive and seriously crazy. He was really difficult to manage. His sister, Jill, went the opposite way. She was flat, blunted, listless, compliant. And so think about that in terms of fight or flight. He was absolutely fight or flight. She was what we call freeze or dissociated. And so we understand that kids from they're not born with resiliency. They learn to regulate themselves in utero up through about 2 and 3 years of age through that serve and return process we talked about in video 1. And so when we look at kids and their ability to handle stress, the early years are the most important. And so when you have children come into your home who had a main caregiver that was meeting all their needs and was in a calm and loving environment, they're able to weather things that would cause a bigger reaction in children who maybe didn't have that beginning time. And so 100% of regulation in babies is through the main caregiver. Now, what we look at when we see kids coming into our home through foster care or through adoption is, how do we regulate these kids or co-regulate them when they didn't have those early experiences? So I think by understanding what Darren's going to talk about, the window of tolerance or a window of stress, we're going to be able to give you guys some tools on what to do with kids that are hypervigilant or hypovigilant, and also the understanding of this. Kids can move between the two. So we used to think it was they go either this way or they go this way. We now know that kids will implement survival strategies that can be both. We also know that 80% of boys tend to be hypervigilant and 80% of girls tend to be hypovigilant. And if we don't step in and help these problems early on, what we end up seeing in the teenage and adult years is girls tend to move to self-harming behaviors because that dissociated thing ends up causing problems with cutting or things that are, like I said, self-harm, where boys tend to go to being rageful and aggressive if we don't step in and help handle those things.
Yeah, so in talking about the window of tolerance, we want to show you this graphic, and this graphic is really good for explaining how this sort of works. And so what we see is there's a normal range for any person. This is not just for kids, this is for anybody. That normal range shows where we can handle some stress. Stress is a normal part of life. And so you see rising and falling action. When you see the rising action, we're coming into a stressful event. And then we regulate ourselves, we handle the stress. Let's say we get a flat tire and it's not fun, but we know how to handle that, and so we make it through. But then you see the red line from a traumatic event that happens. And what that means is there's an event that happens that is so far beyond our ability to handle and regulate that it puts us out of that window. And it could be something really, really serious. Where we go to the hypervigilance where it says stuck on, or hypovigilance where it says stuck off. So those are those two places where we saw with those Jack and Jill foster children. Jack was definitely in that stuck on position. His window was very small. He had not developed a large window of tolerance because he had grown up in stress and chaos and not been cared for appropriately, and not taught by his mom that people are safe and that the world is predictable and all those things that we want to know as infants. And so his window was small, and so he was living constantly in that hypervigilant, stuck on position. So he had a lot of anxiety. He could not relax. In fact, it took months and months for him to be able to just sit down and have a conversation, or just sit and not even talk, just be relaxed. His body felt very, I think, abnormal in those times. And so he could not just be calm. And so for him, normal was, he had been sensitized. And so his normal was an elevated amount of hypervigilance. And so he was always active and going, and that was the way he coped with the trauma that he had experienced. And his sister, Jill, had the exact opposite strategy. She would sit in your lap. She would sit on the couch next to you. She would play with her doll real quiet, and she would smile and smile for days because she was trying to just survive through the moment. And so when we look at this image of a window of tolerance, it helps explain that we can be stuck. And I see it at school a lot. As a school teacher, I'm working with students. The social anxiety that high schoolers have, it puts them on a heightened sense of alertness all day long because they never want to make a mistake in front of their peers. They never want to get laughed at. They never want to get embarrassed. They don't want to be too smart, and they don't want to be too stupid. They want to just try to hide all day long. And that's that social anxiety factor. So what I see as a teacher, and when we work with teachers, we try to talk to them about how students' window of tolerance is low it's very small when they're in school because they're so stressed out already. And so then all it takes is for another student to say something or make a comment or give them a look, and all of a sudden they just react and they go, well, we say they stress out, right? Well, what that means is they moved out of their window of tolerance. And then when a child moves out of their window, they're going to have a behavior that we don't want. So they react to stress, and out of the stress, they lie, they fight, they run away, they scream and yell, they kick, they do all those bad behaviors, but it's because they have moved out of their ability to regulate themselves. So as a teacher, what I have to watch for, and as foster parents, we have to do the same thing. We have to watch for the things that cause our students or our kids to start to move out of that window of tolerance. And so when we start to recognize that there are things that they start to become fidgety, or you can sort of see the look on their face, and that's a point where we really want to try to step in and intervene with them through relationship, right? Through some form of co-regulation for them. And it might mean distracting them with something to eat, like let's say, hey, let's go get a snack. It might mean, hey, come sit with me, or it might say, let's go for a walk, something to take their mind back into where they can be calm. And so I think this is really important. We watch for those things that tend to put our kids out of that window. And you'll see it as you keep this in mind, working with your foster children, that window is really small. And a lot of them don't even ever live inside of that window of tolerance. They're always either hypervigilant or hypovigilant.
One of the things that I think that you take away from this is understanding that we're asking you to ignore the behavior. Your child or your foster child or the child in your classroom didn't wake up this morning and say, you know what, today I'm going to give my parent a hell of a hard time. That's never in their conscious thought to do that. And so when we can ignore the behavior and we see the need behind the behavior, then we start a healing process. And the more trauma a child has experienced, the earlier on, the more narrow their window is. And so what we need to do as the parents or as the person working with this child is help them widen the window. And how we widen the window is through relationship and through environment. Those are the only two ways we can change the brain, and it can be changed. We know that neuroplasticity, or the plasticness of the brain, is very large from in utero to about 18 months. But there's also another window of time in the pre-teens to the early teens that we have a lot of ability to have input. And so when we are looking at working with our kids and widening that window, we're going to leverage environment first, because relationship with new foster kids is not there yet. We're going to leverage environment. And so I wanted to end with a story of Jill. So Jill, like I said, for an almost 2-year-old, was incredibly compliant as a baby. Total blank affect, total flat face. It was just the saddest thing. Every evening, my husband would wrestle in the living room with all the kids, and she would sit and just watch from a distance. And he would have fun, and he would say, come play, and she would just ignore him. But what we noticed as a continuation of the same thing happening every evening at the same time is she started inching her way closer and closer to him. Until about a month in, and this took almost a month, she actually leaned on him when he was wrestling with the kids. Now, he didn't grab her or do anything. He was letting her come to him on her own terms. Until finally one evening when he was wrestling and she was leaned on him, she fell backwards into his lap and she laughed. And so what had happened was the environment was used to help provide a sense of trust and relationship. And so when you guys are looking at providing environment, it needs to almost be like Groundhog Day at your house. You need to have lunch at the same time. You need to have a nap time. You need to have a bedtime. You need to have schedules, and you need to talk about them before they happen. And it gets old and it gets boring, but understand when your kids are in a window, and it's right here, the minute you do something new or novel, their brain is going to flip out. Just like we talked about in the last video. Their brain does this because their amygdala is sounding an alarm because you just introduced something new. And that's why you see our kids struggle at Christmas time or holidays or going on a trip somewhere that you've never been. So what that needs to, it doesn't mean you can't do new things. It just means you have to prepare them and understand you're going to see behaviors. And at the end of the day, we as parents have to ignore the behavior and see the need behind the behavior.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us today on this video. Hopefully you learned a little bit about window of tolerance and how to help your foster child stay in that window and to look for those things that put them out of their window. Fostering is really, really hard. The behaviors are very, very challenging. So we are not, I wish we could say we had the magic answer to solving the behavioral problems, but there isn't one. And so we just are just trying to provide some understanding of where the behaviors come from so that we can adjust our own expectations and try to meet our kids where they are.
And just to add on to what Darren has said, we also have to be cognizant of our own windows. So when you are outside of your window, that is not a time to try and co-regulate your kid. It's not going to happen. And so think about the healthy things that you can do to bring yourself back into those windows. So anyway, until next time, thank you for joining us on video number 3.